Welcome to this online event, which is all about salt marshes on the River Dart. This is the third of 3 events that Bioregional Learning Centre and the team around the Championing Coastal Coordination project on the Dart have been running. And this particular focus, the focus of this particular meeting, is really to hear from all of you. We'll obviously give you some information about salt marshes, but we'd very much like to hear how you would like to be involved. So this is a somewhat perhaps unusual project, in as much as the Environment Agency is becoming more and more active in including local communities in restoration projects. And the purpose of this project is not just to restore and revive salt marshes, also to involve local people, which is why we're very delighted to see you here. So I'm Isabel Carlisle. I'm part of the Bioregional Learning Centre. I'm here with my Bioregional Learning Centre colleagues, Jane Brady, Emilio Mula, and Elena Plugaro, who you'll be hearing from later on. We're also joined by Nigel Mortimer from AONB South Devon, who's in a minute is going to talk to us about salt marshes from the salt marsh. And Emma, delighted to see you here from the Environment Agency. That's brilliant you're able to make it. So what we're going to do is give you a short explanation of how the meeting will run. And then we're going to hand over to Nigel to tell us what a salt marsh is. So we're going to upfront have some news from the salt marshes, and then we're going to hear from all of you what your interests are, a little bit about your background. We're going to watch a short film, which Emilio has made to go with this project. We're going to dive into the role of communications, and Jane is going to lead us on a discussion around that. What are the most powerful ways that you've experienced communication about the local environment? And then we're going to have an open discussion about how all of you can get involved. But Nigel, what I'd like to do now is hand over to you to talk to us from the Kingsbridge Salcombe estuary.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm right at the very top of Collepit Creek at the moment, and I'm going to change the view from a camera so you can see the view that I can see. So this is the very head of Collepit Creek. I'm not going to dwell too much on this estuary because we're really here to talk about the Dart estuary, but just remember that the Salcombe Kingsbridge estuary is what we call a dendritic rear. It's like a big hand with fingers. So each one of those fingers is a creek in its own right, whereas the Dart estuary is more of a linear feature. But of course, it's got sort of side creeks as well. So salt marshes. Salt marshes are a feature of estuarine foreshores. So as you look out here, that's the area of the mudflats that are covered and uncovered by the tide every day. Today is a huge tide, so the tide is a long way out there. And just for your interest, right on the horizon of the mudflats, there's an extensive dwarf seagrass beds as well. So the salt marsh is this bit right at the very, very top of the foreshore. And importantly, salt marshes exist where the tide doesn't quite cover every single day. If it's covered every single day, it's really the domain of the mudflats on estuaries or places where you'll also have seaweeds. So salt marshes, obviously, whole communities. They're a habitat of plants, but they support an incredible ecosystem, very important. Typical of estuaries, the diversity of species is not incredible, but you know, when you look at the populations, they can be quite immense. Now, I mentioned that, of course, in the southwest, our estuaries are rear-type estuaries, so their features are that they tend to be long, steep-sided, and salt marshes are very similar to that. They tend to be these thin habitats along the edge. So the plants that exist here all have to be fairly salt tolerant. And very soon after, just a little bit above where the tide reaches, you've got terrestrial plants coming down. The thing about salt marsh is that if it wasn't for the salt, the land plants would take over. They would outcompete the salt marsh plants. But these have these a range of special adaptations to be able to tolerate the salt. They can do things like excrete it. tolerate it, or some plants just get through their life cycle very quickly before the salt kind of catches up with them. So down here we've got a sedge, and then just behind we've got the coaster child of the salt marsh world, which is the sea aster. Unfortunately, at this time of year, most salt marsh plants have died back for the winter, probably partly due to the salt to sort of get over to the next year. But very soon we're seeing evidence of growth for the spring, and the real time to see it is kind of late spring into the summer, when you'll see some of the plants here in flower. We should also say something about tidal reed beds. I'm not sure what that one actually is, but if I pan around to the other side, you have in the background, probably a little bit in the shadows there, we have tidal reed bed as well. They are a salt marsh, but unusually in nature, they're more of a kind of monoculture of one plant, but they do support a diversity of species within them. And then down there in the center, there's a clump of cordgrass. Probably best if I take any questions about salt marshes, actually, and then I can sort of answer people's interest.
That's a very good idea, Nigel. Before we go into that, could you say something about where the salt marshes are on the River Dart?
Yes, certainly. It's probably one of the easiest things to do is probably go and have a look on Google Earth, a satellite image, and it just zoom in and explore the edges. The big ones that you will tend to see are the tidal reed beds up at Sharpham, and then the other side of Sharpham, you've got more of a classic salt marsh. The heads of most of the creeks, they're at small areas, or if you want to get a little bit close up, it's not the best example of salt marsh in the world, but if you head down along Longmarsh, along the footpath, you'll see not so much a salt marsh, but plenty of salt marsh plants. I mean, it's a narrow ribbon. I mean, as I said, it's one of those areas of the top of the foreshore, not quite covered by every tide. So in places like that, which is fairly steep, it's a very narrow ribbon of plants.
Very good. So let's take some questions about salt marshes. Yes.
I would love to know if you can hear me okay, first of all.
Yes, Anna, I can hear you very loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us along. This is really informative and very inspiring for me. I'm an illustrator and a writer, and I write about nature. And I moved down to Devon coming up 3 years ago. And I have a particular interest along, obviously, the Dart, because it is our sort of lifeblood, if you like, of where we are near Dartmouth. And I want to know particularly if there's a bird population that relies heavily on the existence of salt marshes.
Oh, interesting. I don't think there's any bird that is really tied to salt marshes. You have birds like swans that sometimes build their nests on salt marshes. Unfortunately, they tend to do it on the neap tides, and they get a bit surprised when the nests float off on the neap tides, and they get surprised when the nests float off in the spring tides. But I can't think of any bird that is really restricted just to salt marsh. But if Emma's here and able to sort of suggest any, then I'm happy to be corrected.
Thank you.
Emma, do you want to come in there?
I wouldn't dare contradict Nigel. I think that there are plenty of birds that will make use of fringe habitats, of which salt marsh is a great example. And you'll get plenty of the intertidal kind of wader birds that will make use of the cover that salt marsh affords them from land-based predators, but also the habitat for foraging and for finding food and prey items. So at the moment, you're probably looking at things like oyster catchers, maybe the curlews and red shanks, green shanks might be starting to come back, and you may get kind of migrant birds popping over now and again, using the Dart as a stopover. But nothing that is uniquely found in salt marsh, but it's obviously a really important habitat for lots of different reasons, and the birds make use of that.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you. Any more questions for Nigel? So Nigel, tell us why you're on the salt marsh today and what you're looking for and what you're listening for.
I'm actually down here. I was hoping to get right down to a rocky shore. I love rock pooling, and being one of the lowest tides of the year, I really wanted to get right down to the water's edge. But I'm a couple of miles away from that, so I'm here on looking at the salt marsh, especially for you guys. What am I listening for? Well, I've mentioned the curlew, but the oyster catchers and all of these things out here. At the moment, it's slightly windy, so I'm not hearing a lot, but I can hear the gurgle of the water in the stream just nearby here.
Because I know you love invertebrates that live in the mud. So I'm wondering if you're going to be looking for some of them today.
All right. Yeah, actually the best time to see those, and this is something I would encourage everybody to do. It's one of those, good, stick it on your bucket list. If you sort of have a paddleboard or a kayak or canoe or something, what you really want to do is land it on the mud. A pontoon is probably a safer way of doing this. Just before the tide reaches you, lie down, get very settled, try not to move, and then just as the water is creeping over the mud, suddenly you'll see all these creatures come to life. You'll see things like ragworms coming out of the mud and foraging for food that maybe have left by the tide. You'll have shore crab that will suddenly come away from their hiding place, hunkered down in the mud, and sort of go off scavenging. Flatfish will follow the water in. Even you might see the what called siphons. They're like the tubes that come out from cockles and tellins, and they can use these like miniature upside down vacuum cleaners, and they sort of vacuum from the surface of the mud, eating detritus, bacteria, and things like diatoms from the surface of the mud. And the tubes are so thin, you can see the food going down. And okay, sorry, you're probably eating your lunch, but the poop coming up.
Very good. And we've talked quite a lot in this project about the role of salt marshes in sequestering carbon. And you gave a really great explanation at the event that we ran at Follerton, which was last week. Can you say a little bit more just to explain to people this really important role that salt marshes have?
Yes, certainly. Well, like all good plants, the salt marsh plants are taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and using the energy of the sun and water to make their own food. But when they die at the end of the season, they kind of rot down into the mud below. But also, when you look around the salt marsh here, you'll see that because of the way they stick out, and when the tides come in, anything that's sort of floating or within the surface of the water will get trapped here, which is why up at the top there's a lot of plant detritus. And over here, you'll see lots of bits of seaweed. They trap this as well, and then that also gets trapped within the sediment underneath the salt marsh. And the sediment underneath salt marsh can be meters deep. And very quickly, because it's so organic, it goes anoxic, and it stores huge amounts of carbon there. And we want to keep it there. So, one of the reasons for conserving the salt marsh where it is because we want to conserve the sediment underneath. Unfortunately, just as salt marshes tend to collect a lot of debris brought in by the tides, it also traps a lot of rubbish. So unfortunately, salt marshes can look rather rubbish laden. But of course, that's up to us to stop the rubbish getting there in the first place. We can do beach cleans, but it's better to stop it from getting there in the first place. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very good. And one last question is about when we're thinking about restoring the salt marshes. We've been looking at examples from other places to learn what they've done. And we've been looking at the natural groins, the kind of woven groins that you can use to, I suppose, kind of prevent salt marshes being washed away, or to enable the salt marsh to form behind a bit of a barrier. And I know that's one of the things we might do on the Dart. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yes, certainly. And when I sort of first started looking at salt marshes, edges of salt marsh I used to take as a signs of erosion. But actually, you do have channels within the salt marsh, and some of these will be natural. But places on the Dart where we know historically there have been salt marsh, it might be a case of putting in these kind of groins along the edge of the channel. And then very quickly and very naturally, they will infill behind with sediment. And then when the sediment gets to a certain level that's not covered by every tide, hopefully you'll get salt marsh on the top. Over on the other side there is an example of where just our own accessing the creek is causing some erosion. There are other places around where you'll find erosion from people bringing their boats, their craft down or retrieving it back onto the shore. Even examples where people come and have picnics and then have a bonfire on top of the salt marsh, because it's kind of almost the cleanest place to do it, not realizing the worth of the salt marsh underneath. So in some instances, yes, restoration will definitely be key. In other places, it's taking away the pressures and then letting salt marsh look after itself, almost a rewilding, if you like.
That's brilliant, Nigel. Are there any questions before we let Nigel go back to his super low tide on the salt marshes?
I have another question, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
Nigel, can you talk a little bit about what you've mentioned a couple of the pressures there facing salt marshes. What are some of the big trends that salt marshes in the estuaries and in the Dart in particular are facing?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, I can sort of, I don't know if you can see, don't seem to be able to zoom the camera, but right out there on the mudflats, you can see a covering of green algae. It's not so much of a problem on the Dart as it is here, but if there's too many nutrients getting into this system, you can get a growth, a bloom of these algae over the mudflats, and then that can wash up over on top of the salt marsh, smothering the salt marsh behind. Issues of maybe too much wake from boats going past, recreation over the areas. We just need to really kind of realize its worth and try and work around the salt marsh wherever we can.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other pressures you were hinting on or thinking of? I've gone out of my mind for the moment. No, that's great.
That's
okay.
great. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you very much. Yes.
Question.
Yes, Jane's waving her hands. She has got a question.
I was just wondering, Nigel, about any kind of extra pressures that might befall the salt marsh with regard to heavy rainfall, flooding, drought, some of the more unusual, well, becoming more usual conditions that we are beginning to see. Somehow I imagine that the salt marsh would do pretty well in a flood scenario, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think both dry and wet salt marshes will tend to do reasonably well. If it gets really dry, they're still going to be getting moisture from the sediment underneath. And of course, we're saying they're not going to flood with every tide, but there'll still be some water that comes in. They might suffer from kind of almost it getting too salty around their roots if it's really dry. When it's wet, the biggest problem, I think, and I've seen it actually here, right in the center of this photograph here, is after very heavy rain, you get some of the sediment washing off the fields and smothering over the salt marsh below. So more a problem of that rather than desiccation or getting too wet.
Great. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking there is no final question for Nigel. No, Nigel, we're going to wave you goodbye and thank you very much indeed.
Okay, no worries. I will stick around for a little while. So if I can be of any use, give me a shout.
Yeah, fantastic. We just don't want to take away time from your project on the salt marsh itself.
Yeah,
so
no problem.
Along the Dart, we've got this interesting challenge in a way. So this project has been, this is its first 3 months, and we had funding to do what's effectively the research and development to find out where the spots are that we might want to home in on, both for restoration, but also thinking about how public could access them more easily. But we're also, apart from looking at where the salt marshes are and what we might restore, we're also very eager to explore all the different ways in which people could get engaged in salt marshes. But it's an interesting balancing act because, as you may have deduced from listening to Nigel, salt marshes are in fact quite fragile in the sense that it doesn't do them much good to land on them and have picnics on them and light fires on them. And if we get too close to them as well, the bird life on them can easily be frightened away. So what we're trying to do here is to step into this kind of enthusiasm that's growing week by week, month by month, for local people to get much more involved with the river and understanding roles that local people could take in order to know more about salt marshes, know more about the river in general, how to protect it, while not accessing it, perhaps to the extent that they would like to. So what we'd like to do now is to open up the floor to all of you and to hear a little bit about your interest in salt marshes and who you are and where you've come from. This is really going to help us in our reporting back, but also thinking about the next phase of the project. And then we'll watch a short film about the salt marshes, which Emilio has made. So let me just start with myself. We're just going to I'm just going to demonstrate in a way, a kind of rapid introduction. So I'm Isabel, I live in Totnes. I've been part of this project since beginning of January, like Jane and Eleanor and Emma and Nigel and Emilio. And I went out in my kayak this morning. I've got a sea kayak, and my partner and I went out on this super high tide, because it's super high and super low in one day. And we got on the water about 7 o'clock in the morning. And it was so high, we were literally paddling over the salt marshes. There was no salt marsh to be seen. The whole thing was covered up. But we did retrieve an enormous amount of rubbish, which I might show you a slide of if I can find it. Let me see if I can share my screen. I think I need to go into my folders. Hang on. Can you see that? Are you seeing a picture of rubbish or not?
Yes.
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 Yes, you are. So that's everything that David and I collected this morning. And it was a lot. You know, we almost had so much rubbish that our kayaks were sinking in the water.
Oh, wow.
So that's something that local people could do. They could go out on litter picks and pick up the rubbish that they find floating around in the reed beds or stuck on branches. But let's do a quick go round, and I will stop my screen share. So that's my connection to salt marshes. It's kind of having kayaked down the Dart for several years now. I can see them quite close too, but I'm very aware that they're quite fragile. Who would like to go next?
I can go next if you like.
Thank you, Jane.
So I'm Jane, part of the Bi-Regional Learning Centre, and I was just thinking about my connections to the Dart and to the Saltmarsh areas, and I would say probably first and foremost it is as a dog owner. Unfortunately, our dog is no longer with us, but we would regularly walk him down to the end of Longmarsh there, and something that occurred to me a while back was around the subject of flea medication, and it's become a little bit of a sort of sore topic for me in terms of how much flea medication is prescribed to dogs, and how much of that ends up in the water. So that's kind of it's an odd connection to the river, but I think it's relevant. I think it's very relevant. And then the other thing that occurs to me is just the magical quality that the Sharpham reed beds have. So I'm still learning about the relationship of mudflats to salt marsh to reed beds, and it's not a simple hierarchy of one is the other or is not. I'm learning about that. But the reed beds, yeah, they do have this kind of magical quality, and I think, and there are ways that you can access the reed beds both from the water and from the land. And there are some thoughts and projects underway to help kind of restore some of the boardwalks and some of the areas in there. So that's kind of something I'm thinking about, like how much access is the right amount. It's kind of nice at the moment because you can explore certain areas. How public should we make it? Those are some of the thoughts that I have, and another type of connection to the river. So I'll pass on maybe to Eleanor.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, everyone. My connection to salt marshes. So I think I have to confess I didn't have much knowledge about salt marshes prior to this project. So it was an ecosystem which I really discovered, and I have fallen in love with during this project. I have listened to a podcast, a really interesting podcast about salt marshes, and there were people as passionate as Nigel and my colleagues who spoke about salt marshes, and not only, and how we can love them from afar. On this journey, when I was reading about salt marshes, I came across a conversation about salt marshes in Charleston in the US, which is a bizarre connection because I'm an event manager, so I support a congress that will go to Charleston this year. So that was another weird connection. So I explored the town from another perspective, and the video was very interesting. It was talking about the locals' connection to salt marshes, and how the father was very sad that his son will not be able to see the salt marshes that he saw and he explored when he was a child, and how they're working to really support the salt marshes or revive the salt marshes. So his son and his future generations, or the future generations, can also enjoy this ecosystem. So that is my quick journey. I can pass it on to Anna.
Take myself off mute so you can't hear my dogs screaming in the background. Well, my sort of introduction to salt marshes really came as a gentle awareness from kayaking down the Dart. When we first moved here, the whole area was just a complete novelty. I originally come from the north coast of Cornwall, where I have to say, apart from Weybridge Estuary, which is where I kind of was nearest, if you like, I wasn't actually aware of estuaries and the life that exists and relies on estuaries, and the different layers of marsh compared to flats, and so it's really from a different viewpoint now. I'm a bit older, bit more interested, less frantic about going out and growing up a bit, and so it's with fresh eyes that I'm looking at this stuff. And as an illustrator, predominantly in the nature, and also writer, it sort of reared its head, the idea of the life of our River Dart in my work, and naturally made me far more inquisitive. I feel like a bit of a gatecrasher on this one, because up until learning about this opportunity to learn a bit more about salt marshes, I wasn't aware of them as a sort of major force along the River Dart. I was just aware of the life around that area, and fascinated by the reliance on that life, in particular bird life. I have to be honest, that's my personal interest along River Dart, which is why I asked the question of Neil regarding which birds would rely on it. And it sounds like they don't necessarily rely on just it. It forms part of their natural environment to survive and grow. And so in that respect, I'm fascinated to see how we could help promote the life within a salt marsh, but without offering it up for people to wade through with their dogs, their children, their picnic hampers, just to make it more interesting and relatable, but without too much physical involvement.
Thanks, Anna. Well, who would you like to pass it on to?
Caroline.
Hello, yes, I'm Caroline, and also I'm here with Chris, and we live in Stoke Gabriel, and we walk quite regularly along the foreshore of the River Dart, which is accessible from Stoke Gabriel, and we also kayak up as far as about Sharpham and back again on a high tide. So we're interested in bird watching and seeing the wildlife. And I'm not sure what we could offer by way of help, but we'd be willing to do surveying, certainly surveying for birds and waders and plants. And we could also do litter picking as well, either walking or from a kayak. So I'll pass on to Emilio.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm quite connected to the River Dart in some ways. As an artist, I think that it's a main part of my inspiration. It comes from walking around and not around the river in different seasons. And, you know, the Saltmarshes actually came out. I didn't know that we had Saltmarshes before the project. And when I found out that the quality of the Saltmarsh, like a kind of a very extreme environment where the level of adaptation of certain plants, it was so high, I felt really inspired about that, and how I, you know, doing the film, making the film for the Bioregional Learning Center, it was just like trying to get closer to that quality of the being with the plants, close to the plants, and imagining what it is that is going on underneath that substrate of sediments, and from the micro and the macro aspect. And yeah, I felt really fascinated about all the salt marshes, and I would love just to carry on doing more exploration about them. So yeah, and I pass it to Sally.
Sorry, just unmuting. A bit like many of us here, but you know, I didn't know a lot about them, and I went to the meeting at Follerton last week. We kayak on the Dart and walk along the Dart, obviously, and I'd be happy to help doing whatever really. I've retired, I've got time, and I'm interested. So yeah, we do pick up litter. I must say, I've never had the haul you had this morning. That was amazing. It's, yeah. So yeah, be happy to help in any way, really. Muriel, would you like to?
There we go. Hi everyone. Yeah, my interest in salt marshes. Yes, I didn't identify them as such. I identified them as just marshes, marshy reed beds things, areas. So yes, thanks for the meeting at Fullerton. That was really interesting. Yeah, I'm also an artist. I suppose it's a source of inspiration. I do get frustrated. I did say on that day at Fullerton by the boats that go by too fast. But you know, how do we stop those? I do not quite know. I have done that to them. I have managed one or two that's stopped, slowed down. I'm fascinated by the amount of fish I sometimes see down the Dart. So for me, salt marshes are sort of an offshoot of my interest in the Dart. I've just always loved rivers. And I've also had the luck to go in the mangroves in Mauritius. So I do kind of know what mangroves look like and their importance and all that. So it's just this unexplored it's kind of like a no man's land. You're not allowed to go there. It's kind of where people used to hide, you know, in southern Florida. And it's kind of that place where it's like the deep jungle in a funny way along the river in its own miniature version. And yes, yeah, just use me however. If there's something I can do to slow those boats down, let me know. And you know, whatever else I can be useful for. I wish I could think. That's the only thing I find frustrating. I love the project, and I'm finding it frustrating that I don't know what to do to help it stay, to help the Saltmarshes stay at least how they are. Let's put it that way, because that's what. Yeah,
that's what we're going to crack. We're going to crack it.
Yeah.
Not this afternoon. We will crack it.
No, okay, never mind.
So Neil, would you like to
Oh,
go
sorry,
next?
yes, I need to pass it.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, my name's Neil. I'm the founder of the Seahorse Trust, and with Jane, I sit on the Devon Environment Foundation group. I'm based sort of at Topsham at the moment on the River Exe, and we do have a lot of salt marsh on the River Exe and huge, extensive reed beds, which is lovely. But I did live in Totnes for 8 years, and like a lot of you, I used to kayak and also camp up and down the River Dart on the river banks and what have you, and nothing nicer than just sitting there with nobody else around at night time, just camping when it's lovely and quiet. But they are fascinating habitats, and through my other work with seahorses, we address all the same problems that are going to face this project as well. How do you get people involved without them destroying the environment? How do you protect the environment and make it better, more vibrant, etc.? And the crucial thing is about funding. I mean, all these projects take a lot of funding, and you know, I'm sure I would echo what Jane would feel as well. If we can put a good funding proposal together to the Devon Environment Foundation, I'm sure they would look at this with very favourable eyes. But I just love salt marshes. I love being on the water, under the water, around water. And Muriel's problem with the boats is an echo I share very loudly, because we had the same problem, particularly on our main study site, which is over in Dorset in Studland Bay. Anywhere up to 350, 400 boats a day, all going at silly speeds when they're only supposed to be going at 5 knots. And I've never cracked how to slow them down, to be honest. Have seen a few of them actually crack themselves on rocks there and sink. Maybe that's the way. Small torpedoes, that'll do it.
Very good. Thank you. Emma, would you like to say something?
Hiya, so I'm Emma McGee. I work for the Environment Agency, but I also live in Stoke Gabriel. So I work in project management to try and get funds for a project like this. So this is what I do. So this is why I'm involved in this project. But I was particularly excited for what we could achieve here on Saltmarshes because of a number of very high level trends, you know, in terms of what projects get funding and where kind of funding money is following at the moment. Intertidal habitats, coastal and estuarine habitats are historically underfunded spaces in terms of the potential kind of for government money to be invested there. And that is starting to change. But there's also more and more narrative around blue carbon. This isn't something this project has really, I don't know, explored to a great extent at the moment, but it is perhaps something we could look as a project management community to kind of emphasize and explore in the future, to unlock more funding for these kinds of projects, to make these kind of self-funding in some respect. That's quite a long way off, and that's not really the reason why I do it, but this is the how of how I do it. I like being out on the Dart. I don't really get many opportunities to do so, although this project has made a few, which is quite nice. But yeah, and Anna, can I just say I've read and really enjoyed reading your book, and I've recommended it to a few people as well, because it perfectly kind of captures what makes parts of, you know, this landscape special. And I think it's inspiration from sources like that. You know, it's the art and hearts and minds thing. How do we get people to care about these kind of fringe habitats? And that's it. You know, it's getting people excited. It's showing it sometimes at a fine level of detail compared to what you would normally see, because you're paying that closer attention. And that's why I'm really excited about what Bioregional Learning Centre have achieved in the short few months that we've had funding for this project for. And I'm working really hard to make sure that we've got some funding into the future, but it's not certain. So if there are people on this call who've got experience and opportunities that you think this project could make use of, then speak up, you know, in terms of what can we do to help Saltmarshes. Funding is always going to be on the list. So any ideas, please do speak up.
Thank you, Emma. That's brilliant. Thank you, everybody. And we're now going to watch a short film that Emilio has made, which is on the Bioregional Learning Centre website. So you can always go and watch it there and share it with your friends. But let's just kind of go into Emilio's film, because this is part of our communications outreach and helping people understand why salt marshes are important, but also they have a particular beauty to them. So we're going to show the film, and then Em is going to say something about the making of the film. I'm going to share my screen in order to play it.
Sound.
Isabel, I think the sound did not come through. So if you'd like to reshare again.
Okay, so the sound isn't coming through?
No.
Okay, it could be that I need to take my my sound out. Let me just try doing that. Hang on. Is that better?
No, that didn't work either.
That's interesting. What would make it work?
Isabella, I had the same problem when I was doing a talk earlier in the week. I just twice now I've had it where it just won't play the sound on a film, which is so unfortunate. I tried to Google it and couldn't see an answer.
In that case, I'm going to encourage you all to go to the website and watch the film. Ellen, if you could put the link directly to
Yes.
the site. Another possibility is we just all watch it now on our own screens. That might work better. That's strange.
I have shared the Bioregion website, and here's the YouTube as well, in case you have a preference.
Nigel says for a second there the sound did work. That's interesting. Was that the second time round, Nigel? Yes, the second time round it did work. Did it work for anybody else the second time around?
I heard a little bit, but I think that the problem is like the buffering, that it's probably the stream is not good enough just to make audio and video, and it's just taking only the video.
Yeah, okay.
I've just started playing it on my other screen there, and it's working perfectly from the website. So
okay, fantastic. Well, let's all just take 3 minutes to watch the film on our own screens following that link, and then reconvene in this meeting. So I'm going to put myself on mute while we do that. I suspect you probably all got to the end of the film. Am I
Hmm.
right?
Beautifully put together, very good.
Good. Well, I'm going to hand over to Emilio to say something about the making of the film and what the intention was behind it.
Isabel, and thank you everyone for watching the film. Well, basically the intention of the film was just to try to bring a kind of an approach of the diversity that you have on the long marshes, from the perspective of the sediment to the perspective of the macro, when you're just looking from an aerial view to that space. And for me, it was just like trying to bring this kind of a connection between the complexity of those sediments and the mix of nutrients that they end up in that space, like in the salt marsh. So what we did is like we captured some sounds from the underwater, and we captured some sounds on the soundscapes from the salt marshes, and the soundtrack is basically created by those sounds, especially the ones that we used underwater. And at the same time, we were I've been generating some generative art that is inspired in the movement of the reeds. So it's the ones that you see at the end. And the other bit is inspired in the kind of the connection of the roots of those plants with the salt particles. So the idea was just like bringing those minimum or very micro approaches to the film, and talking a little bit about the diversity, of all the things that they are part of the salt marshes. And we collaborated with different artists, 5 different artists. Some of them, they did cyanotypes for the piece, like the blue images that you were seeing. And another ones, they did some sketches, and we get a collection of pictures in a trip that we did all together. And in some ways, it's just like a compilation of textures that I will love just to go a little bit further with it if we get the future funding for the project. And any questions,
thank
please
you.
let me know.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that you're already struck by the resilience of salt marshes, their ability to be in the space between fresh water and salt water, and to adapt to these very rapidly changing conditions, and it can, changing from being completely flooded to completely dry, or more or less salty, very salty or not so salty. And I think in a way you saw this as a kind of metaphor for what we're having to do with climate change, becoming much more adaptable ourselves. And I know I find that quite inspiring when I think about salt marshes, their ability to be resilient and adaptable. But we'd love to get some feedback on the film and just hear how it struck you. Is this something that's going to be able to bring more people into the orbit of the salt marsh?
I was going to say I found it very engaging. Emma made a reference to involving the public and making them feel that it matters to them. And I think drawing on your film, which is beautiful, incredibly atmospheric, it emotionally engages someone. It evokes that sense of wonder and mystery. And I think this is what will get more and more support from the public. We all know the facts, we get it jammed down our throats about, climate change, blah, 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 but why aren't we all jumping up and helping? And the reason is because I think we're allowing ourselves, or as a public, we are allowed to feel slightly removed from it all the time. We just close our computer, we close the newspaper, we go make a cup of tea, which is what I just did. But the truth is we are let off the hook because we're not emotionally grabbed by it. And I think more of the stuff that you're producing, Emilio, will really help in projects like this. Every project I can remember throwing money at is because I felt it was part of me. I was definitely part of the problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's good.
I found the video to be a very different kind of tool and communication channel to that I'm used to working for the Environment Agency on government funded projects. They typically have a very strong science base, and that's entirely appropriate sometimes. But what we're facing as a challenge here is, I think when we were writing the business case, we used a quote from David Attenborough, which I really enjoy because I think it's hugely relevant to this project. And it was something along the lines of people will never care about, people won't protect what they don't care about, and they won't care about what they've never seen. And I think that what we've tried to do here and what this film does really well is bring people to salt marshes, show them what they look like close up, underwater, what that experiential kind of representation was for different people. You know, it is physically demonstrating how different types of people have engaged with and responded to the environment in a very kind of quite a unique habitat. I think, you know, as a lot of us have talked about on this call, it's not perhaps a habitat that we've really thought much about or really experienced at that level before. So I think it shines a spotlight on what makes Saltmarsh different. And what I'm hoping is that it can bring people, you know, into the conversation and into the folds of any future manifestation of this project. Because it's different to, you know, here's some facts and figures, and here's a list of really urgent things that we all have to do right away. And you know, and instead this is about positively enjoying a habitat instead of the kind of eco-anxiety route that a lot of calls to action tend to take. So I really like that this is playing on the positives and the strengths of that habitat. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
I think, Isabel, you hit the nail on the head just now. Amelia, that was a beautiful film. I loved it. We are always, though, preaching to the converted in situations like this. And one of the big issues that we had at Studland Bay is how do we engage people with the problems with seahorses? I mean, we have seahorses in the Dart up as far as Dittersham. They go slightly into the freshwater areas sometimes, mainly into the saltwater. But how do you engage them? And interesting, for those of you that live in Stoke Gabriel, that was one of my major areas for collecting shrimps to feed seahorses at one stage when I was captive breeding them. And it's finding that hook, it's finding that species and that storyteller. David Attenborough is very good at picking species. I was very lucky to work with the BBC Natural History Unit for 2 years on Life on Earth and Living Planet, and he was very good at using a storyteller, and we do that with the seahorses. They tell the story of seagrass, they tell the story of other things going on, and it's finding that unique storyteller for salt marshes that we need, that will be iconic enough that people go wow, like they do with seahorses, but doesn't detract away from how unique a salt marsh is. I mean, it's okay to educate people like ourselves that already have a passion and interest in it, but it's getting to those other ones that, like Anna or Anne, was it Anna or Anne? I'm not sure. And like Anne said, you know, everybody shuts their computer down, turns their TVs off, shuts the radio off, and that's it. They go away, make the proverbial cup of tea. You know, it's how do we explore that even further? It's a very, very difficult one. You know, a lot of us are still exploring these ideas now of how to engage people even more. And when we were started our eco mooring work at Studland Bay, we put 10 eco moorings in, and the gentleman who funded or not funded it, but enabled it to happen, he always said, this will not solve the problem. It will not cure boat anchors in Studland Bay, but it will start the conversation. And it did. And that was the seahorses, and the eco moorings were our hook, that were our storytellers. And now we've just got funding for another 22 to go in. We're hoping to have up to 100 in the next few years, because it's engaged people. And that film was very beautiful. I love those style of films, absolutely gorgeous, and well done to you for putting it together. Absolutely brilliant.
Very helpful. Thank you very much, Neil. If there are no more, are there any more things that people want to add before we move on?
Don't think there's much, just to say, yeah, it's experiential, and I think that that is what people need. And so people who don't visit the salt marshes, because there's probably a lot of people who like David Attenborough films, why do we watch them? We watch them because we don't go to those places. So to be able to experience the feeling of being in them when you know nothing about them is a super learning tool. Yeah. Bravissimo.
Thank you. And thank you for your help with the film as well.
Yeah,
Jane, I'm going to hand over to you because you are our lead on communications and engagement, really. If you could share with us your thoughts, the thoughts that you've been having so far about this project and where it might go and the challenges that we have around communication.
Sure. So let's see. I think, as you all know, this is the first phase of a 3-phase project, and the emphasis was very much on community engagement for this first phase. In the later phases, I think we will move more into the surveying work and get a little bit more of a realistic sense of what's out there, where the salt marsh is, etc. So just thinking back to our own process, we really began, I guess, with our own network. And what I'm realizing is that this project is, for us, is really sort of a continuation of the work that we have been doing on the Dart for the past 5 or 6 years. And I think that's really important to just state that perhaps the success of this very short phase is rooted in the fact that we are the bioregional team. We live here, we understand the place. And I was reminded of one of our early projects, which is the Dart Charter. So we co-created a charter for the River Dart at Dartington. And I have it actually here. Right here.
Excellent.
This is the enormous Dart Charter. And I was just wondering if Saltmarsh made an appearance, and it doesn't specifically, but I guess that's because Dartington is above the weir. But it's interesting just to reflect for a moment on some of the wording here. In this place of Dartington, we especially value and name as our shared assets the vital role as a wildlife corridor for otters, birds, especially kingfishers and fish, healthy water in sufficient quantity, trees along the banks, particularly the oaks that give the Dart its name, and the stability of their roots, a cherished river that enhances our mental and physical well-being, provides tranquility, beauty, and memories now and for future generations. Respectful, agreed access along the sacred length of the river from Totnes to Staverton, where we enjoy the water both in and beside it. So I guess it's one of the things it's done for me is just renew my energy around the charter as a tool, and imagine what a charter for the estuary might look like, and the kinds of Saltmarsh would obviously be one of the elements that is picked up on and included in a charter. So I think that's kind of interesting, that the work that we've done really feels like a continuation of the work that we've been doing for many years. In terms of, how we went about it, I guess you have to do certain things when you are undertaking communications for a project. So we needed a basic identity for the project. We needed sort of the elevator pitch. We needed a bit of a story, and the way that we created that was to come up with the concept of living Dart as sort of an umbrella, if you like, so that living dart, perhaps in the future, we can tell the Saltmarsh story, but then we could also tell a mudflat story or different habitats, so that it could continue in that way. So we did the basic things: the identity, the posting on social media, etc. Holding this challenge, which has been spoken about, which is, people shouldn't, or they really shouldn't access these areas. So how could we potentially inspire people with the communications that we're producing, such that they feel, such that they understand more, they learn more, but they feel connected to the Saltmarsh in a way that they hadn't before. So that was kind of the major challenge, I think, underneath all of the basic comms that we did. And I would say it felt really important, and I'm so glad to hear that this is being endorsed by everything you've said. We felt it was so important to explore some other directions. So yes, we can provide information, and we have a resource pack that will be sent out to everybody who's expressed an interest with links and so forth. But the film, I think, was really our first exploration of an idea that could, who knows where that could go. It could become, we had ideas of an installation or a sensory room, or ways in which those kinds of media, cloud mapping, what else could we bring to the table, and have sort of technology work for us in a way. And one thing I wonder, based on the poll, and Eleanor will speak in a minute about the poll and some of the results that we are getting, and I don't want to preempt that, but it is interesting to me that people are choosing the kinds of things that they can do fairly easily remotely. So things like sign a petition, sign the Dart Charter, maybe watch a podcast, and I think Emilio and I had put, so we were so drawn by this idea of how else can we do this, and I'm wondering if maybe some of the language in the poll was off-putting. So, for example, we had, what about a 3D virtual experience, or a virtual art gallery, or some way of kind of replicating the magic of the Saltmarsh, but in a different space, so that you weren't actually there trampling, but you could get a sense of it. And those things tended to score lower than some of the kind of quick fix, if you like, quick fix ideas. So I think what I've picked up on is a couple of things that Neil said. One was this idea of how do you start the conversation. So that really, I think, is what we have done in our convening work, and will continue to do, and continue to think about other ways to start that conversation, but also the storytelling side of it. There are some very interesting methods now for compiling images with text and leading you through a story. So, but all of those things are kind of technological, if you like. So I'm sort of left wondering and I would be really interested in your thoughts, like, what's missing, what's next, what else could we do, what did you see as successful? Like I say, we've covered the basics with the website, the social media, the identity for the project, but are we missing something? We'd just like to hear if you have any thoughts, however out there or tangential they might seem. Muriel.
Okay. A few years ago, there was a great big van. So this is a massive thought, of course. There was a great big van that was, not a van, in fact, it was a car. Anyway, big thing that was parked near Longmarsh, and you looked through the loopholes. Known sculptor, and he had done a whole installation inside. something like that in Longmarsh, but that needs funding, would really do it. Now, the other thing is I'm thinking about Neil's thing with the seahorses. So seahorses are endearing little creatures. We like them. But is there any way of creating like a mini area just before, you know, at the end of Longmarsh, where a lot of people go, you go down those steps and you're on the edge of the salt marshes, and where we could somehow or other bring more life into that area so people can see it? Or is there anything like that that can be, because then you bring your kids to come and see the.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I do remember that installation. I think that was the KLF.
I can't remember. He was
the
really
guy from the KLF. But yeah, it was like a container, but you could look into it.
Yeah, I was looking at the container.
Yeah, nice idea.
I've just put a link to Project Seagrass on the chat there. Project Seagrass really only emerged a few years ago, and in the very short time that they've been going, they've actually just exploded with all their media, with their coverage and all the rest of it. And they do tell an incredibly good story. And even people like Southampton University and others that have been working with seagrass a lot longer have been kicked into the shade, because Project Seagrass are so good at telling their story, and they do it through all sorts of things, from pop-up events, through very good animation, through an incredibly good website, which you'll see when you open it up. So it's quite diverse in what they're doing. It's not just one thing, it's a variety of things. And I suppose the key question you've got to ask yourself is, why would people be interested in salt marshes? That's the first and foremost question. And then, you know, the average person really doesn't care about the environment. I've got a neighbor who's a classic example, always tells me she loves nature, wants to work with nature and all the rest of it. But because I've got seagulls nesting on my roof that wake her at 4 a.m. in the morning, she's persuaded half of my neighbors to put anti-seagull stuff up. So, you know, it's all right until it affects them personally. So it's trying to find a way of engaging people that will keep them engaged. And I was saying just now about Stoke Gabriel, this little shrimp that I used to shrimp for the seahorses, called a mysis shrimp. And it literally does go from freshwater all the way out to the sea. But as Nigel will know quite well, the mysis shrimp is a very key species in that sort of area. It cleans the algae off. It has two ways of feeding it. Cleans the algae off mud, but it also puts its legs out like a basket and sits facing into the current, so it's like a plankton catcher as well. So it's finding something enigmatic that will actually tell you a story. I'm not sure what at this stage, but there was some really good I think it was Mira was putting some suggestions there, or Nigel, you know, sea aster, marsh samphire, or an insect, or one of the inhabitants. And the question from Anne earlier on about what birds were there is a really good one as well, because if you could find a really enigmatic bird that lives in the marsh, that again will tell the story. You know, I mean, egrets are a great one.
Yeah, I'm listening and I totally agree, Neil. But I'm thinking humans, as you say, they like things until it becomes a disturbance. But when they can see that things actually are useful to them, because we really do like to take things just for ourselves, they will then take an interest in it. So your little plankton there, your little shrimp that actually can clean boats. Wow. Oh, this thing's useful. So it's finding some of these creatures, and I don't know them, but finding the way that they are helping us and highlighting that. Because that's the bit that needs to be highlighted. The fact that they're happily living there and looking beautiful, that's good for us artists. That's no good for the rest of them. But the fact that they're actually helping us and are useful to our air quality or God knows what, then people are interested. It's really sad, but that's humans are like that. We need to know it's useful
Very
to us.
much, yeah.
It's interesting where this conversation is going, because we're homing in on a thing. And bi-regional learning centre is always trying to get people to think in systems and not just thinking one thing at a time. But anyway, we'll see where this goes. Caroline, you've got something to add.
Yes, a few people have mentioned the blue carbon of the salt marsh.
Yeah.
I keep hearing of all different things that are meant to be the best possible thing for removing carbon, whether it's I don't know, rainforests or the seaweed, etc., seagrass. So when you say that salt marsh is really good for removing carbon, kind of how good is it? Is it, say, better than seagrass and more important than woodland? I just wondered if you could sort of give a perspective of, on the scale of useful things, how useful it is.
Yes, well, Nigel's really the expert on that, but yes, it is more effective than woodland per area at capturing carbon. Nigel, you able to come in on that one? He may have just disappeared.
Yes, I think we just lost Nigel.
Just lost him. So yes.
The tide has just come back in and he's going down the river now. So,
there is a
Would you like me to
statistic.
help answer that question?
Oh yes, go on, Emma, please do.
So I think that the short answer is it depends. The long answer is that the best case scenario is that it can be up to 50 times more carbon sequestration than a forest, for example. But it will depend on things like the status of the condition of the salt marsh and whether it's left alone, because the way in which a salt marsh will lock up carbon is in the sediment. So the plant matter that decays and that stays in situ or is, you know, kind of retained within the environment, the local environment. If it's disturbed and that sediment is lost, then the carbon sequestration associated with it kind of becomes unknown. It could be released back into the environment or it could be sequestered elsewhere, but it's quite hard to work that bit out. And that's why blue carbon and the narratives around it are still developing. And in terms of, you know, paying for a ton of carbon to be sequestered in salt marsh or seagrass or anything like that isn't there as a market product yet. But there are people looking at that. I'm certainly not you know, involved in that level of detail, but I think there are people looking at that as an avenue. I think Nigel has possibly rejoined us. Can you hear us and are you able to add anything?
Yes, sorry, I was going to jump in and then press the wrong button and got lost. Yeah, this whole thing about how good salt marshes are for carbon, we've got to be so careful if we're kind of comparing apples and pears and this kind of thing. I'm sure that per square inch of tropical rainforest, they probably sequester more carbon than the salt marsh around me, particularly at this time of year, but it's that long-term storage thing. With tropical rainforest, it's very quickly recycled into other things, whereas here, as Emma was just saying, it gets down into the sediment and it could be there for hundreds, thousands, longer years. So quite incredible. And of course, not every salt marsh is equal. We've got the tidal reed beds, we've got the salt marsh, and not forgetting the mudflats just below it. It all comes in together, and I think we've got to be so careful. Yes, we need to kind of highlight the champions, but at the same time, we've got to be a little bit careful with how we compare them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you. So we've got 10 minutes left. I want to give some time to Eleanor to tell us about the poll. So perhaps we could just do that quickly.
Sure. Thank you, Isabel. I would like to ask if there's anyone who hasn't taken the poll yet. If you could raise your hand. So it seems that everyone has taken the poll, which is great. Thank you so much for your input. So we have had the poll active since the start of the month. We have been sharing this on social media, via our newsletter, and then at our events. We have been actively encouraging people to take the poll. I will share my screen. So I would like to share with you in the next few minutes the results of the poll. So this is what we are seeing as people have answered and have indicated in terms of their learning experience. What are their choices? So when designing this poll, we were looking at it on various stages. So we were looking at what can people do by themselves in terms of learning about salt marshes? How can they expand then this knowledge to one other person? So it would be between two people. Then we expanded this to a group. Then we kind of got a little bit closer to the salt marsh. We know that we shouldn't get too close, so we were very, very mindful of that during the design stage. So we have had 67 people answering this poll. So in this first section, we can see that it was all about learning. Primarily the options that we have suggested were individual learning. So things like listening to a subject-specific podcast, watching a webinar, visiting an art installation in a public space. So those are the three that are the most preferred options. People have indicated that they would like to do those. And then visiting a landmark public artwork at the estuary, interacting with the existing resources like an app. There is a Saltmarsh app. If you have an iPhone, you can download that. And then a 3D experience. Those were the other options that people indicated they would be interested in taking. Throughout the poll, we have seen that there isn't really anything that people wouldn't engage with. So we have seen that all the options got some interest. It's just a matter of how much interest. So when sharing their knowledge, we offer the following options. And most people, they said that they would like to mention or share something they've learned about salt marshes with a friend over coffee. So that was the most selected option. Then they can share images or short film like the one we've produced on social media or on other channels. They would like to amaze their friends with a key fact, and then share resources or visit a virtual art exhibition. As Jane has shared previously, we have noticed that the 3D virtual experience and the virtual art exhibition weren't amongst the ones that were closer to the top. These probably we would think that it's a good way to engage with the salt marshes. So maybe it is the wording as Jane was saying. Next, convening. So we saw that signing a petition is at the top. Taking part in a one-off guided Saltmarsh meeting, it's also at the top. And then we have the other options following. So taking part in a regular guided meeting, as BLC has been facilitating for the Devon Donut and other projects. This is somewhere in the middle. And then the other two options have also responses, but less. In the exploring section, this is where we thought that people could get a little bit closer, but also at a distance. So encountering interpretive signs as they walk or hike, so they would like to see that. Some were interested in joining a guided boat or canoe tour, or doing a self-guided kayak tour, and then paddleboard is the least mentioned option. And lastly, we asked if they would be interested, or how would they be interested in becoming an ambassador. And we saw here that the Dart Charter was the top, and then joining in a guided litter pick came second, and the other options such as joining some training with helping with restoration, supporting a non-profit, doing already restoration work, advocating for government resources and so on. They came next. So this is a very useful resource for us to understand how people would like to interact with the salt marsh. I think I would like to take this opportunity also to briefly show you our website, which you might be familiar with already. So on our website, if you go through this page, you will be taken to our project page. And here we will be adding the resources. So the poll, which is still active here, and we have added actually the recording from the Thursday event here, so you can watch it later, and then other resources will be added here as well. So this is a good resource to use and share with your networks if you're interested. So I'll stop sharing now. Isabel, is there anything else I need to cover?
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. And it's very interesting to see what people are most excited in. I think that could change. I think if there was more concrete things on offer, people might get an appetite for actually physically helping to put groins on the salt marshes, whatever it might be. So we're coming very close to the end of the meeting, and I don't know if there's any last words that people want to say, maybe ideas they'd like to share with us before we leave. We've nearly got to the end of our first 3 funded months. So we finish this in about a week's time on the 31st of March. And we'll be putting much of what you've shared with us into the report that will then go to Emma, and we will base our application for phase 2 funding on that report. If there's anything that any of you would like to kind of give us as some parting words.
I've just put some links into the chat there that might be useful. One of them is a project that Jane and I helped fund through Devon Environment Foundation, Till the Coast is Clear. They tried to clear rubbish from obscure areas that people can't usually get to. The other link is Bright Tide, which is an organization set up by a lawyer friend of mine, Harry, and it's all about carbon sequestration and blue carbon, etc. So those two might be good links. But I have to say, I've known Nigel for many a year, and it's great to see him looking very David Attenborough in the reed bed there. So it's brilliant to see that.
Well, I can't see the links in the chat, Neil. I don't know why. Can other people see them?
No, I can't see them either.
Jane
has
can.
them.
Maybe Jane, you can capture them. I'm not quite sure what's going on there.
Oh, you know what? I think Neil, you just sent them as a direct message. So
sorry, Jane.
No worries. I can capture them. It's okay.
Brilliant.
Yep.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
I'd be really interested, Neil, to find out more about those. It's Emma McGee from the Environment Agency. Jane, are you happy if Jane shares those with me?
By all means, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Jane, you could almost pop them in now into the chat and share them with everybody.
Yeah, let me just try and do that.
You can copy them.
Oh, I see. It does say direct message. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, don't worry. So while Jane's doing that, only remains to say thank you very much for coming to this meeting. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. We've got your email address now through the Eventbrite registration that you did for this meeting, so we'll keep you up to date. And fingers crossed that we get ongoing funding to do this project. We're really excited to see where we could take it next.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isabel?
Hello.
Stop the recording.